Okay guys, I'm back again after a quick interval. I forgot I had a delivery coming, so I had to take care of that. But I'm back and I'll just continue where I left off at page 186. I was getting right into that too. Right. Anyway, I just want to say hello to D-Truth, Gully Squad, Malav Cocktail and Kaka Venegas, who joined me today. Hope you came back. Anyway, I'm going to read where I left off, and it was the Old Testament, right? In the name... sorry guys, I'll... Ready my ugly pus fees and get... In the name of the Assyrians and others, the Goths and the Saxons were led into the true Palestine, dubbed Israelites, and succeeded in establishing themselves over a great part. The Celts, or Egyptians for their part, having to retreat northwards when it would seem they constructed that enormous series of defences termed the Wansdyke, stretched from beyond Savernake Forest to the north to the mouth of the Avon, thus shielding Rabbath Ammon or Bath from the enemy. Those who erected this vast barrier with varying outlying forts must have been fighting the enemy to the death. Wansdyke signifies the dike or wall of Woden, otherwise Odin, and Odin and Zalmoxis were very near to one another. Historians, including Kemble, Lappenberg and Palgrave, have all contended that Saxons under various names were in Britain from a very early period. So where was this place? We'll have a wee look at this. Wansdyke. Wansdyke. Earthwork. Here we are, Wansdyke earthwork. Wansdyke is a series of early medieval defensive linear earthworks in the west country of England, consisting of a ditch and a running embankment from the ditch spoil, with the ditching facing north. There are two main parts: an eastern dyke which runs between Savernake Forest and Morgan's Hill in Wiltshire, and a western dyke which runs from Monkton Combe to the ancient hill fort of Maze Knoll in historic Somerset. Between these two dykes there is a middle section formed by the remains of the London to Bath Roman road. There is also some evidence in charters that extended west from Maze Knoll to the coast of the Severn estuary, but this is uncertain. It may possibly define a post-Roman boundary. Post-Roman. So like I said guys, all these places exist. Whatever motive may be ascribed to Moses or Rabshakeh, there was definitely a policy to expel the existing population and bestow the fairest lands for sheep raising and agriculture on the Saxons. He may have been inspired by a genuine hatred of the debased polytheism as practiced by both Egyptians and the Phoenicians. He may have been influenced by the admiration for the sturdy characteristics of the Goth and Saxon peoples who accepted him as their leader, or, again, it may have been due to overweening ambition to dominate the civilized world, which has shown itself as the beckoning finger of doom to tyrant after tyrant throughout the ages, and none more than those living in the present age. But one result of his activities still lies as an unquenchable fire. I refer to the age-inherited and implacable hatred felt for the Saxon race by the Welsh and the Irish Celts. A hatred inexplicably and unreasonable, but a never-ending racial antagonism which time cannot assuage. It is a psychological reaction which ages cannot obliterate, for it is instinctive. I cannot terminate this investigation into the activities of Moses in the age under review without turning to another apparent phase of that extraordinary man's career. The question is whether he was also the same as Zoroaster, who converted the Median and Persian kings to his monotheistic doctrines at an early period, and also taught them the arts of black magic. Zoroaster, or Zerdusht, was never claimed as an original, but he arrived in Persia and preached the consuming fire was the only proper emblem of the deity. Regarded at first as an impostor, he was imprisoned by Gustasp, king of Persia, but owing to the efforts of Isfandir, the king's son, who became a convert to his doctrine, he was released, and finally Gustasp accepted with enthusiasm the prophet and his teachings. Like Zalmoxis, to apply his consuming fire, Zoroaster, a word meaning bright azure star, i.e. lightning, built a subterranean temple where the king was initiated into certain divine secrets in a house of fire, after which temples of fire were erected, both by Gustasp and Isfandir, by which means it was said, and with the aid of Zoroaster, the Persians were enabled to conquer the countries of the Orient, including India, and so became by much means the founder of the greatest of Oriental empires. In the sinister phenomenon of the ancient world appears to lie the explanation of how there came to pass the appalling spectacle in which first Assyria and then the Median Empire were able to grind all peaceable nations underfoot by the use of armaments none could withstand, whereby powerful cities like Nineveh and Babylon fell like ninepins later, before the devouring force of Cyrus, whose addition to the cult of Jehovah, otherwise Iccus or Bacchus Dionysus, is indicated in the book of Daniel and in Bel and the Dragon. Strange is it that Pliny, in discussing magic, which he admitted sprang from chemistry, should have remarked that the Druids might have well taught the Persians. Prophet or no prophet, there is little doubt but that Zoroaster was a scientist, or he had the means to impose a new type of force upon the suffering world by certain knowledge only divulged to a few. For all that many of his own era regarded him with deep suspicion, the Persian poet Ferdowsi says that the devil spoke to him out of a flame, and in the Shah Nama relates how Asjasp, king of Tartary, told his chiefs that glory, wisdom, and true religion had fled from Persia because a sorcerer, styling himself a prophet, had corrupted the princes of that country. Others declared him to be an impostor and a false prophet, asserting that the devil himself, Ahriman, had taught him a new and blasphemous doctrine. The inference is obvious. Zoroaster became the prophet and lawgiver to the Persians in the same way as Moses to the children of Israel, or Zalmoxis to the Getae or Saxons, and as Odin became to the Asar, or those he led into the Baltic and Scandinavian lands. He received, it was said, the book of the law from Ormuzd, the Persian deity, as Moses received the like in the 2 tables of stone he brought down from the Mount Sinai. Again, like Moses, he was said to have been a dangerous child, also the divine messenger, who performed miracles of like nature, such as striking the rock with his staff when water gushed forth. Like Moses, Zalmoxis, and Odin, he disappeared for considerable periods, and these curious appearances and disappearances suggest that his manifold activities were such that, since even a magician cannot be in 2 places at once, he was busily engaged in first one place and then another in the furtherance of his principal object. Dion Chrysostom says that he withdrew from men and dwelt in solitude upon a mountain consumed by fire, but that he escaped injury and addressed the multitude, words which entirely conform with the Bible says of Moses. When did Zoroaster live? It was a vexed question. Writers in the Encyclopaedia Britannica place it at some vague prehistoric date. Pliny, for once, summarising that he lived 500 years before Plato. Others more succinctly that it was before the split in the Aryans, which is exactly the age when Moses lived. It is admitted that he bore many resemblances to Moses, but some proclaimed him with the false prophet Baal. Without any wish to complicate this question, we ought not to ignore that strange and significant myth which revolves around the god Dionysus and the prophet Silenus, for it bears strange indications of having preserved the folk memory of an invasion of the west by a Zoroaster-led army from the east, in which all the oft erstwhile styled false prophet Silenus became the all-conquering by reason of his deity Dionysus, the serpent god, proclaimed by his followers as devouring fire or consuming fire. That the myth of Silenus is not a mere fantasy is perhaps indicated by the legend, which relates that he taught Midas, the gold-grasping king of Phrygia, that in the west beyond the ocean lived the Meropes, among whom gold was more common than iron. The origin of Dionysus is somewhat obscure, the earliest version being that, as Zagreus, a horned child, he was the son of Saturn by Persephone, goddess of Hades, and was born in Crete, destined to supreme dominion if he reached maturity. He was not then so destined, for the Titans, incited by the jealous Hera, smeared their faces with plaster, while the youthful Zagreus was seated on the throne, guarded by Apollo and the Curetes, slew him while he contemplated his face in a mirror, then cut up his body and boiled it. Athene carried his heart to Zeus, who struck down the Titans into Tartarus. A possible interpretation is that before Zagreus reached maturity, some deed of the Titans was the cause whereby Zeus destroyed them. Another version is that Dionysus was born at Cadmean, Thebes, the son of Zeus and Semele, daughter of Cadmus. This birth was also premature because Zeus materialized before Semele as lightning, which so terrified her that she died, and hence the god epithet. Ignagina, born of fire, Zeus, however, sewed the prematurely born deity in his thigh until the time became ripe for his further development. Entrusted to the care of Hermes, he was once again given birth or reborn at Samothrace, the great centre of his secret worship, home of the Kibiri, the city where Zalmoxis was so industrious in the underground caves. A further variation is that he was developed in a cave on Mount Nisa, of which Homer sings, "There is a certain Nisa, mountain high, with forests thick, and Phoenician afar, close to Egyptus stream." These accounts of the birth and parentage of Dionysus afford a mythological explanation that, although the god was evolved in Crete and also in Cadmean Thebes, as previously explained, Abram brought the knowledge of explosives from Ur to the Chaldees. It was later at Samothrace, the city of Hermes. May we not say through the activities of Zalmoxis that he burst forth as a god of firearms or serpents on the prodigious scale of subsequent events. If we read into this deft hand of the militant prophet, it may assist to comprehend the subsequent allusions to the god's future madness, his wanderings through many countries bent on teaching mankind the blessings of the cultivation of the grape, an innocent sounding enough device, but as sinister nevertheless as Pandora's box. Thus he reputedly travelled from Thrace to Phrygia, where it is noted lay the famous classic city of Troy, to Lydia in Assyria, preaching the gospel of the grape, until eventually he reached the Orient and tried his experiments on India, where fire temples were traditionally instituted and the wealth of our cities looted. Obviously behind the god was concealed a man, and who was he but Silenus? The Dionysiac worship was almost frenzied and fanatical in Phrygia and Lydia, where the orgies attained, says the historian Grote, to dissolute and savage heights. It is necessary to declaim that the East never absorbed the virtues of the vine and the grape. Triumphant and established the dominion of the Dionysiac worship, eventually Silenus and Dionysus set forth on their portentous march to the west, accompanied by a great army. Diodorus says that his army consisted of 120,000 footmen, 12,000 horse and 400 ships, which compares numerically with the story in the book of Judith of the army of Nabuchodonosor or Sennacherib of 120,000 foot, 12,000 horse, swelled by a great number also of sundry countries like locusts. Forces scarcely consistent with the genial idea of Bacchanalian revels. Jeremiah strips this sham pretense asunder in a grim passage. "Take the wine cup of this fury at my hand, and cause all the nations to drink it. and they shall drink it and be moved and be mad, because of the sword that it will send among them. That sounds like they were using wine as like a weapon of war. Get the people drunk and then get rid of them. Jeremiah, in his ex post facto prophecy, which always so much is wrapped up having a totally different reference to that supposed, continues by naming all the countries to suffer, including Egypt, the Philistines, Edom, Moab, Dedan, and the isles beyond the sea. Thus we must perceive that the march of Dionysus with Silenus was not quite the jovial festival the fable so deceptively portrays. Regarded apart from Silenus, the god Dionysus was in fact a colourless deity. Silenus mystically reared and fathered him and taught him the great secrets of nature. The supposedly rollicking god of the vine was depicted by poets and sculptors as surrounded by his camp followers, most prominent being his drunken and inseparable companion Silenus, the latter usually shown as being held on his ass by his own Seleni, unable to sit upright, waving a goblet, his head encircled by vine leaves or ivy leaves, while exotic beasts of prey, tigers, panthers, serpents, and the like are prominent in the gathering. So who's this person? We've already looked at Dionysus in the earlier episode. Silenus. See who Silenus is. Whoop, sorry guys. Oh, there he is with his grapes and his cup. Silenus. In Greek mythology, Silenus was a companion and tutor to the wine god Dionysus. He is typically older than the satyrs of the Dionysian retinue, Thyasos, and sometimes considerably older, in which case he may be referred to as Paposolenius. The plural Seleni refers to the mythological figure as a type that is sometimes thought to be differentiated from the satyr, but by having the attributes of a horse rather than a goat, though usage of the two words is not consistent enough to permit a sharp distinction. A drunken Silenus, Parian marble, Roman artwork of the 2nd century. There's something Ramish about him. The original Silenus resembled a folkloric man of the forest with the ears of a horse and sometimes also the tail and legs of a horse. The later Seleni were drunken followers of Dionysus, usually bald and fat with thick lips and squat noses and having the legs of a human. Later still, the plural Seleni went out of use and the only references were to one individual named Silenus, the teacher and faithful companion of the wine god Dionysus. A notorious consumer of wine, he was usually drunk and had to be supported by satyrs or carried by a donkey. Silenus was described as the oldest, wisest and most drunken of the followers of the Dionysus, and was said in Orphic hymns to be the young god's tutor. This puts him in a company of phallic or half-animal tutors of the gods, a group that includes Priapus, Hermaphroditus, Sedalion, Chiron, and also includes Pallas, the tutor of Athena. When intoxicated, Silenus was said to possess special knowledge and the powers of prophecy. Cool. It's the first time I've heard of this dude. Silenus was supposed to possess the gift of prophecy when in his cups, and as for his mischievous Seleni or satyrs, half men, half goats, it reminds you of Pan, the god Pan. They enjoyed nothing better than to pursue the fleeing maenads or nymphs in the forest glades. Behind this false facade, they were in reality murderous villains who struck terror in the hearts of men and whose taste in warfare was demonstrated by the peculiar armed dance, the Sekinis, very reminiscent of the berserker rage or madness attributed to Odin's Azarmen, who were supposed to bite their shields in furious ecstasy. They were the men who used the serpent rods of improved design and range, and the play on the word grape may have been related to their type of ammunition. Such was the allegorical type of those invaders who marched to northern Europe to establish their new order for the alleged benefit of mankind and found their way to both sides of the Baltic, then crossing the river. Recall the 400 ships of Diodorus fell upon the nations unprepared for war against those well-armed hordes. The vine grape and wine were synonyms for munitions and bloodshed. Dionysus was usually represented by the Greeks far later as a handsome but effeminate youth, his head adorned with vine or ivy leaves, his expression reflective or dreamy, giving a faint impression of inebriation as shown in the famous statue of Praxiteles. Sometimes he was styled Meamonemus, the drunken god. The Vatican statue of supposedly King Sardanapalus is believed by some to have represented Dionysus. It shows a bearded effeminate youth, attired in royal Persian robes, but there is reason to believe that the mystic secret of Dionysic power was more truly revealed in certain stone monuments discovered in the ruined cities of Iraq and Iran of gigantic cherubim standing on either sides of a so-called sacred tree, from which the emanations proceeded in the guise of fluorescent designs and really demonstrate in a symbolic form the Seleni as manifesting, consuming fire, the tree being a gun or mortar. All these winged beings or acolytes, the symbolic of their calling, are pronouncedly Semitic in type. There exists also a crude bas relief on a stone near Ibris in the Taunus Mountains, which depicts a smirking Semitic Dionysus, decorated with grapes and carrying sheaves of corn, being worshipped by a Semitic high priest wearing a mitre, probably intended for Silenus. The attributes of Dionysus and his progress to sow the knowledge of the vine support the historical and Bible evidence that the cult of munitions was brought in high state of development in that era by Moses or Zalmoxis or Zoroaster or Silenus, perfected in Persia or Russia, and that thereby the empire of the Celts was cynically overthrown in that critical epoch. If it had been carried to its logical conclusions, we should believe that it arrived in the north with Odin, otherwise Silenus or Moses, a faith which held immense sway for many centuries and for long was a successful rival of Christianity. It became the black art and the origin of witchcraft. Concealed under mystery and disguised the evolution of Dionysus was in fact a military revolution in the use of munitions of war, much as the discovery of the atom bomb may prove in our own era. Is history repeating itself? I pray not. Silenus was represented as a pot-bellied, bearded, jovial old sot with a bald head and a snub nose. Like many a Carassauan monk of the Middle Ages, it was part of the role, no doubt, although Moses or Zoroaster might have formed the original of the caricature. Diodorus has preserved a curious description, supposedly of Moses, found later in Jerusalem. Antiochus Epiphanes, after he had conquered the Jews, entered into the Holy of Holies, into which only priests were admitted. He found there a stone image of a bearded man who sat on an ass and held a book in his hand. He took this from Moses, who had founded Jerusalem, organised the people, given them laws, and had introduced the disgraceful customs of misanthropy. A doubtless more true impression of Silenus than as a dotard is a relief in the British Museum, as also found in the Vatican and the Louvre, which represents the reception of Dionysus by Icarus, the Attican. In this he appears as a tall, aged, dignified, long-bearded man, attired in a long robe, with a fillet binding his vine leaf locks, while he is propped up behind by a satyr. It is intended to be Silenus, not the serpent god. A few words about Odin, or Vortan, are required to complete the examination. He conducted his Azar men from the east, as did Silenus. Moses and Zalmoxis founded a new religion in the north, and while esteemed as a mortal man, became deified at his death as god of war. He built temples and taught sacrifices, magic, and transmigration of souls, being included in his rites. He practiced magic in underground temples, and Snorre Sturluson, the ancient Scandinavian historian, says he used magic in battle. The serpent was scared to him, and among his many epithets was the serpent, as well as the long-bearded. Saxo Grammaticus discourses on his many voyages, and he was reputed to undertake long journeys. The prose Edda described him as king of Troy, and he appointed rulers who met at Idaval, Mount Ida of Troy, in the centre of the divine city, where also they transmuted metals. Mexican legends have much to say of Voltan, who also taught a new religion and constructed underground chambers, but there seems to have been more than one Votan, and it is not unlikely that the cult of Odin was carried across the Atlantic by early Northmen. The age of Odin is obscure and lost in the mists of time, like that of Zoroaster and Zalmoxis. It varies from 70 BC to an indefinite prehistoric period. Carlyle, that sage philosopher, sized up the conundrum in these words. Of Odin there exists no history, no document of it, no guess about it worth repeating. Odin, says Saxo Grammaticus, came into Europe about the year 70 before Christ, of all which, as grounded on mere uncertainties, found to be untenable now, I need say nothing, far, very far beyond the year 70. Odin's date, adventures, whole terrestrial history, figure and environment are sunk from us forever into unknown thousands of years. Nevertheless, the reader may deduce whether or not the evidence brought forward here relates to that one remarkable character, Moses, or no. His teachings, like the Saxons, remain with us to this day. That he was Rabshakeh is, I believe, without serious question, especially in the view of the revision of chronology which confirms this. Meanwhile, having endeavoured to elucidate the circumstances, return to the actual period under examination. The 14th year of the War of Oppression, at the time when Jerusalem was strictly besieged, certain defences had fallen, and the situation was most desperate. A quick drink, guys. And have a quick look at chat as well. See who's here. If anyone. There's a new face here. It's Weedy in the dock. Jed, I left a message and question on your last video. Cheers, Weedy. I'll get round to answering that later, Weedy, and thanks. Thanks for leaving a question. Anyway, back to this. It was about the time that Isaiah, pent up in Jerusalem, wrote these despondent, if not despairing words. So shall the king of Assyria lead away the Mizraimites prisoners, and the Cushites captive, young and old, naked and barefoot, even to their buttocks uncovered to the shame of Mizraim. And the inhabitants of this isle shall say in that day, Behold, such is our expectation, whether we fly for help to be delivered from the kings of Assyria, and how shall we escape? The passage is clumsily worded, but appears to ask how it was possible for the other inhabitants of this isle to elude similar treatment as that being suffered by the Egyptians and the Cushites, Gadites, or of Tarshish, who were being led away into slavery stark naked. To whom could Jerusalem look for aid? How could she escape from the logical conclusion that a like fate awaited her inhabitants? Only a miracle, in fact, could save them from their plight. Astonishing as it may seem, the miracle did happen at the 11th hour and they were saved. And note, according to the text, that the grim drama took place in this isle, this Britain. So this is I think this is chapter 3 of the climax. In the earlier years of King Hezekiah, reign efforts were made to strengthen the defences of Jerusalem, which had been left in a powerless condition by King Ahaz. The wall was built up to the height of the towers, another wall was added, the army was reconstituted, and new arms were supplied in abundance. Consequently, when Shalmaneser died, the tribute which the Judeans had been forced to pay to the Assyrians was not forthcoming, because they believed themselves sufficiently strong to ignore the demand. Sennacherib when his missionaries had been treated with derision, including among others Judah, eventually sent a large and powerful army against the recalcitrant city, an army composed of many nationalities, and laid long and close siege to it. Gradually, as it tightened and the plight of the people became more precarious, with the fate of Samaria doubtless in their minds, fear became widespread. They had seen and heard Rabshakeh. They, or the rulers, recognized his desire was not to tribute, for they had not stripped the temple of all its treasures to provide it. No, the intent was to overthrow the kingdom of Judah. Jerusalem is ruined, cried Isaiah. Judah is fallen. A little later he pulls aside the veil yet further. It is a day of trouble and of perplexity by the Lord of hosts in the valley of vision, breaking down the walls and crying, reverberating to the mountains. And Elam bore the quiver with the chariots and horsemen, and Kieran covered the shield. Thy choicest valleys shall be full of chariots, and the horsemen shall set themselves in array at the gate. Ye have seen also the breaches of the city, which they are many. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die. Such was the desperate situation with, be it noted, Persian chariots and cavalry and infantrymen from Media before the walls and gates, where many breaches had already been effected. The triumphant Assyrian king, Nebuchadnezzar of the Book of Judith, had previously defeated the proud Arphaxad, king of Media, Kir, and the Persian, Elam, who were now swelling his armies, and Jerusalem was on the verge of collapse. Isaiah cited above is represented partly in the future tense, the usual ex post facto custom according to the prophets, although he mentions the breaches in the present tense as having happened. In addition, the city was suffering from a grievous pestilence. As Jerusalem was thus tottering, the king himself was laid low and in extremis. At this crisis he was visited by Isaiah, who said sternly, Set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. Hezekiah wept sore and prayed to the Lord, whereby the prophet relented, ordered his attendants to place a poultice of figs on the sore, and told the king that the Lord would deliver his city from the Syrians, that he would be well enough to visit the temple on the third day, and that he would reign for another 15 years. Hezekiah evidently felt some doubt respecting this optimism. He was somewhat natural in the circumstances and asked for some sign of proof. Thereupon Isaiah offered a remarkable sign or omen. In the garden of the royal palace stood the sundial of Ahaz, and the prophet said that the sun should be retarded by 10 degrees backward. So the sun returned 10 degrees, by which degrees it was gone down. In other words, that day was lengthened by 10 hours. Whether the prophet offers such a test is, of itself, no major importance to the investigation, or whether he actually forecasts that Hezekiah would visit the temple on the third day and reign for another 15 years. The crucial factor is that, according to the account given, the retarding of the sun by 10 hours beyond his wanted time indicated something phenomenal in the heavens, of which we must assume Isaiah was aware. It signified a total day of 34 hours. This recalls a sentence in the Book of Enoch, Ethiopian edition, which says, In these days the sun shall rise in the evening, and as a great chariot journey to the west, causing distress as it goes. The sun could not, of course, have performed so eccentric a course as to return by 10 degrees on his track. On the other hand, a comet approaching the earth very closely and throwing its light when the sun sank could and would have shed its rays, as Enoch says. Seneca, for instance, described the comet of 146 BC, which appeared just after the death of Demetrius, king of Assyria, as little inferior to the sun in size, a circle of red fire, and sparkling with a light so bright as to surmount the obscurity of the night. The comet that seemed to menace Jerusalem in AD 70, when Titus was besieging it, was called Zixvius, says Josephus, because its tail resembled the blade of a sword. I remember seeing this in the Museum of Scotland, actually. Many records describe comets as like great suns, and it may be believed such was the case in the period of Hezekiah. The prophet Zechariah, grandfather of the king, a Levite noble of great distinction, explains the lengthened day in question in these words: "It shall be one day, not day nor night, but it shall be light." And a striking passage also Isaiah, whose words should be read properly in the past tense, describes plainly those crucial hours. "Thou shalt be visited by the Lord of hosts, with thunder and earthquake and great noise, with storm and tempest, and the flame of devouring fire, and there be upon every high hill rivers and streams of water in the day of slaughter, when the towers fall. Moreover, the light of the moon shall be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun shall be sevenfold as the light of 7 days. And the Lord shall cause his glorious voice to be heard, and shall show the lightning down of his arm, with the indignation of his anger, and with the flame of a devouring fire, with scatterings and tempests and hailstorms. For through the voice of the Lord shall the Assyrian be beaten down, smote with a rod." The preliminary to this is a verse which describes how the enemy were encamped around David's city and had laid siege to it with a mount and force. Isaiah's meaning is clear beyond cavil. There was earthquake, storm, tempest, great thunder, and blazing fire, the collapse of buildings and towers falling on the phenomenal brightness of the sun, or so he terms it, shining 7 times with the power of his usual might. Intimidating that the celestial body was about to fall on them, and that it was how the Assyrian was beaten down despite his superior arms. Enoch confirms this brilliancy of the celestial body, saying, "The sun shall shine more brightly than accords with his order of light." It stands to reason, with the half light previously, with the thunders and lightning also devouring fire, apart from the tempest, that it was no sun on this occasion. In Esdras we find, as the threat was approaching, this advice: "And the Sodomitish sea shall cast out fish, and make a noise in the night which may have not known. And salt water shall be found in the sweet, and all friends shall destroy one another. Then shall wit hide itself, and understanding withdraw itself from the secret chamber." And Isaiah gives similar advice: "Come, my people, enter thou into the chambers, and shut thy doors about thee. Hide thyself, as it were for a little moment, until the indignation be passed over." Recollect, with all this, the previous untoward events, such as prolonged drought, drying up of rivers, and various other plagues, including invasions of frogs, insects, etc. While the king lay tossing on his bed of sickness, Isaiah and many others would have heard the rumblings of an approaching tempest, and those tortured hours when the unending day dragged onwards, and the sun again rose towards the evening time, throwing a strange, garish, and glaring light upon an apprehensive world. Then, doubtless, the wise ones did conceal themselves in secret underground chambers until the fury or indignation of the Lord had passed over. We may summarize that the king Hezekiah was conveyed to safety, probably deep in the underground tunnels of the city of David. Zechariah has preserved the most complete and dramatic version of this terrible event. He, a priest who had understandings in the visions of God, and who was the father of Abi, the mother of Hezekiah, hence the king's maternal grandfather. He was a leading noble in the reigns of Uzziah and Ahaz, and like other prophets is represented in ex post facto prophetic language. "I will gather all nations together against Jerusalem to battle. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city." Zechariah confirms and even enlarges on the hopeless situation of Jerusalem as described by Isaiah. The city, or part of it, was already in the power of the enemy hordes, with all of the excesses attendant on the helpless populations who fell into their clutches. But seemingly, while one half of the city was looted, the rest yet stood up behind their defences. There then follows a vivid description of the celestial event of that fateful twilight, yet which was destined to prove Judah's salvation. Zechariah describes how the Mount of Olives was split in two, and how streams of water poured into the nearer and farther seas on the tremendous night, which was not day nor night. Ye shall flee into the valley of the mountains, yea, ye shall flee, like as ye fled from before the earthquakes in the days of Uzziah. In that day the light shall not be clear or dark. Living waters shall go out of Jerusalem, half of them towards the nearer sea, and half of them towards the hinder sea. It shall be lifted up from Benjamin's gate into the place of the first gate, unto the corner of the gate, and from the tower of Hananeel into the king's wine presses. Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. And this shall be the plague whereof the Lord will smite all the people that have fought against Jerusalem. The flesh shall consume away while they stand upon their feet. Their eyes shall consume away in their holes, and their tongues shall consume away in their mouths. Here we have the description of an eyewitness able to tell us precisely what damage the earthquake caused, and to name the actual parts of the city which had suffered most. We have the vivid description of the eerie light before the blow, the crash upon the Mount of Olives, which is split in two, the shaking of the city as the earth rises and falls in the sickening motion of all earthquakes, followed by the draining of the seas and waters by a tidal wave, and their furious return, accompanied by a tempest and floods, which pour with violence into the two seas, and finally the flight of the survivors in panic to the mountains, anywhere to escape the appalling visitation. Yet Jerusalem remained standing, a miracle of God. And the even more astonishing miracle whereby the invading host was destroyed in one great blast, which burnt them with fire even where they stood. Such is Zechariah's graphic story. A sheer drama could never surpass the events of the night of the prodigies, beginning with the threatening apprehension of a night that never arrived. First of all, a terrifying brightness, then a continuous strange and luminous twilight with an immense circular red sun, perceptible to those who dared look through a mystical nimbus which increased rapidly in size hour by hour as it approached nearer and nearer, its edges flashing coruscations of dazzling light accompanied by growing thunders, and reverberated among the surrounding mountains in long ominous rolls, each more menacing than the last. Nature, meantime, awaiting the inevitable hour, lay hushed and still, the silence only broken by the twitterings of affrighted birds or by the screams of terrified humanity, until with a sudden deafening roar the crash fell. Many tens of thousands of lives were lost that night in more places than one. Egypt, Havilah, Amenta, true a part of Jerusalem lay in ruins, yet, amid the desolation, the beautiful city so justly extolled by the prophets survived the Holocaust around her. Her affliction was great indeed, as Isaiah laments in a petition for mercy in these eloquent words. Be not wroth very sore, O Lord, neither remember iniquity forever. Behold, see, we beseech thee, we are thy people. Thy holy cities are a wilderness. Zion is a wilderness. Jerusalem a desolation. Our holy land, our holy and our beautiful house, where our fathers praised thee, is burned up with fire, and all our pleasant things were laid waste. Wilt thou restrain thyself for these things, O Lord? Wilt thou hold thy peace and afflict us very sore? But what of the enemy who surrounded the city and held half of it in its cruel grasp? That same night struck down and burnt with fire, as Zechariah states. Isaiah confirms it was a terse sentence. Then the angel of the Lord went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. He described the event as a blast. It was, indeed, a mighty blast, which consumed them by violent waves of magnetic flames, so that they lay in a vast clusters and 185,000 charred and mutilated corpses. The effect of the remainder of the Assyrians was immediate. Sennacherib broke off the campaign and returned hurriedly across to the river to his capital, Nineveh, where he was shortly afterwards murdered. Berosus, the Babylonian Chaldean, sought to gloss over an event that shook the world to its foundations, saying that when Sennacherib was returning from his Egyptian war, and on his way to Jerusalem he found Rabshakeh with his army in danger, for God had sent a pestilential distemper upon his army, which might be described as a considerable understatement. Herodotus reports a garbled account of how Sennacherib was besieged Pelusium, and that Sethos, the Egyptian king, faced by the refusal of his soldiers to fight for him, prayed before the image of Ptah at Memphis, who told him to go forth and face the Assyrian host. Thereupon Sethos collected uncertain artisans, traders, and market people and marched them to Pelusium. In the night vast numbers of mice gnawed the bows of armour and the armour of the Assyrians, and being unarmed in the morning, the motley Egyptian force decimated their ranks and the remainder fled. Yet the true story of the Holocaust must have spread abroad, for we read that the king of Babylon sent a special embassy with letters and gifts to Hezekiah, whose mission was to inquire of the wonder that was done in the land. That blast, it certainly was a wonder. A vast host suddenly consumed, to use Zechariah's words, at that moment when Jerusalem lay at their very feet. Their camp was silent, their bodies distorted, and numbers were buried under rocks and stones that fell on them, as described by Ezekiel, who terms them Gog and Magog, names well known in the antiquities of Britain, but not elsewhere. Yet it must be appreciated that the experience of Jerusalem, apart from the spectacular and moral effect, was but a small portion of the result of the unending night and the vast face of the malign comet. We may glean from the records of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the apocryphal book of wisdom the lurid picture of the frightful and devastation experienced in the epicenter of the visitation in Egypt, all crouched in the usual prophetic strain except for the book of wisdom. Isaiah says, "And the Lord shall utterly destroy the tongue of the Mesmerite sea, and with his mighty wand shall he shake over the river, and shall smite it into 7 streams, and make men go over dry shod. And there shall be a highway, for the remnant of his people shall be left from Assyria." Was not this a reference to those Hebrews and others who escaped so mysteriously from Pharaoh across the sea of Suf or Sedge, truly a tongue of the Mesmerite sea? Ezekiel portrays the fate of Egypt graphically. "The land of Mizraim shall be desolate and waste, from the tower of Seneh and to the border of Cush. No foot of man shall pass through it, nor foot of beast, neither shall it be inhabited 40 years. And I will scatter the Mesmerites among the nations, and I will make the land of Egypt desolate in the midst of the countries that are desolate. And her cities among the cities that are laid waste shall be desolate 40 years, and I will scatter the Mesmerites among the nations." What a profound destruction is here implied. A great region defined, say, from Wessex to the western highlands of Scotland, and including part of Ireland, uninhabited for 40 years, a desolation amid others destroyed lands. Jeremiah, speaking of the cup of wine of the Lord's fury, mentions among those who drink of its bitterness Pharaoh, king of Mizraim, and the princes and all his people, and all the mingled people, and all the kings of the Philistines, Ashkelon, and Azah, Gaza, and the Ekron, and the remnant of Ashdod, Edom, and Moab, and the children of Ammon, Dedan and Tamar, and Buz, and all in the furthermost corners. All these infer a tremendous catastrophe. It was Isaiah's day of slaughter, and this is seemingly born out of Ezekiel's 30th chapter, which records that great fear overcame Cush when the slain fell down in Mizraim, and their foundations were broken down, naming Pathros, Zoan, No, and Sin among those famed places rendered desolate. At Taphnes the day was darkened, and the arm of Pharaoh was broken. Finally, we should probe slightly into wisdom. From chapter 6, maybe, onwards, that work is mainly concerned with this subject. It says, "Thou tookest away the multitude of their children, and destroyedst them altogether in a mighty water. Of that night were our fathers certified afore." In this book, the word Egyptian is avoided, and Sodom or Sodomites is employed. The name of that Gads or Tartessus classic scene of the end of the Titans. In that long night, the Mesmerites were drowned and consumed by fire. It is vividly portrayed as, for example, "For the ungodly that denied to know thee were scourged by the strength of thy arm. With strange rains, hails, and showers were they persecuted, and through fire were they consumed. For when righteous men thought to oppress the holy nation, they being shut up in their houses, prisoners of darkness, and fettered with the bonds of a long night, lay there exiled from the eternal providence. No power of the fire might give them light, neither could the bright flames of the stars endure to lighten that horrible night, images of that darkness which should afterward receive them." Observe the phrases "a long night" and "that horrible night." In the following passage, reproaches are cast at the Gadites or Tartessians dwelling in the western lands, the traditional scene of carnage, because they forced into bondage those friends that deserved the well of the city of Sodom. For they, Hebrews, were yet mindful of the things that were done while they sojourned in a strange land, and how the ground brought forth flies instead of cattle, and how the rivers cast up a multitude of frogs instead of fishes. And punishments came upon the sinners, not without the former signs by the force of thunders, for they suffered justly according to their own wickedness, inasmuch as they used a more hard and hateful behaviour towards the strangers. For the Sodomites did not receive those whom they knew not whence they came, but these brought friends into bondage that deserved well of them. Therefore with blindness were these stricken, as were those at the door of the righteous man, when, being encompassed with a horrible great darkness, everyone sought the passage of his own doors. The righteous man suffered with the sinners, and the complaint of the Hebrews appears to have been that the people of Sodom did not show them friendship or accommodate, and were punished accordingly by the flood or the great catastrophe. They were the plagues, then fire consumed them also, then they were surrounded by a horrible great darkness in the course of a long night, seeking shelter in their houses, and thus they went into the grave. The Israelites, seeking to move south, escaped the Holocaust because they had been previously forewarned. Such, then, derived from the scriptures, were the main effects of this tremendous visitation from on high, of such magnitude and force that for 40 years tracts in the land of Egypt remained unapproachable and compelled the few who could escape to flee to other countries. We see a succession of earthquakes and electric phenomena accompanied by a tempest and a flood which destroyed, besides cities and property, great numbers of human beings, and yet spared Jerusalem for the most part, and simultaneously devoured the flower of the Assyrian army then besieging it. It must have been a vast catastrophe which committed such worldwide depredations, and it is not surprising that the king of Babylon not only sent a special embassy to discover the facts, but described it as the wonder in the land. The description of the phenomenon given by the prophets Isaiah and Zechariah, precedent to the actual event, the day lengthened by 10 hours, or seemingly so, and the enormity of the destruction caused throughout so many other countries, and especially Mizraim, proclaimed that the source of the disaster was the collision of a comet with our earth, depositing vast quantities of stone and rocks, creating terrible earthquakes, causing widespread volcanic eruptions, bringing with it magnetic and electrical flames, and followed immediately by a tempest and enormous floods. This occurred simultaneously over an immense area in the north of Europe, although, as in the case of the drift distribution of materia, it was irregular in its incidence, some parts utterly destroyed and others almost escaping, as may be said in the case of Jerusalem, which fortunately lay outside the main area of actual contact. Jerusalem, it seems, from the descriptions which have come down to us, was devastated by earthquake, caused by the passage overhead of the cometary body, as has happened in dozens of instances in modern times when large meteors have caused magnetic oscillations from a flood due to cloudburst and flaming fire preceding the comet itself, which destroyed the blast the Assyrians round the city. It was the flood of Noah, whose habitat lay in Scotland, as I have shown in my previous work, known to the Greeks as the deluge of Deucalion, in which the actual main regions are denoted. Quick drink, guys. It may appear strange to the average reader why this terrible catastrophe, which brought so many earth changes in its wake, should have been hidden away in the scriptures, so that to get at the circumstances it is necessary to have recourse to the prophets, and, in most cases, to veiled accounts couched in the conventional framework of prophecy. Whereas the somewhat stark story of the flood is told in Genesis as though it was an event that had taken place ages before their time. The reason, partly, in this destruction of the ancient world was that the celestial visitation was treated as holy and had to be veiled in mysticism, and partly because of the deceptive and misleading chronology of the Old Testament. Nevertheless, certain discrepancies reveal the flaws. There is the case of Sodom, otherwise Gades or Tartessus, whose destruction is plainly evidenced in the Book of Wisdom. In Genesis, the burning fire of Sodom and Gomorrah is told as quite separate event from that of the flood, whereas in Wisdom it is definitely shown as happening about the time of the Exodus. The catastrophe of Sodom is wedged into the period of Abram and Lot, but that this was a fabrication or Hadashah. Hadashah is seen in statements in Isaiah and Ezekiel, for the former speaks of Sodom and Gomorrah as existing in his own period. Hear the words of the Lord, ye rulers of Sodom, he cries. Give ear unto the law of our God, ye people of Gomorrah. To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me, saith the Lord? Then, after chastening them for the vain oblations, he adds, if ye be willing and obedient, ye shall eat the good of the land, but if ye refuse and rebel, ye shall be devoured by the sword, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. If words signify anything at all, it is perfectly obvious that in Isaiah's day, when these words were spoken or written, he is reproaching Sodom and Gomorrah for their lapses and threatening them with the sword if they did not cease their idolatry. It is impossible to conjecture that Isaiah was using this reproof of a region which had been destroyed centuries before. The inference is that Sodom then flourished, was backsliding and too friendly with the Egyptians, a situation quite conceivable when the true geography and situation of the Gadites is able to be appreciated. Ezekiel, living about 100 years after Isaiah, compares Sodom with her daughters, with Jerusalem and Samaria, and he implies that all three were overthrown by human agency, using Sodom as an illustration in such a manner as suggests that her fate was a comparatively recent event. His words do not even bear the implication that Sodom was completely obliterated, but rather that it was defeated and enslaved. It was invaded and defeated, but also suffered from the devastation that overwhelmed what had been paradise. In the following passage, he is comparing Sodom with the fate which was suffered by Samaria. Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy, and they were haughty and committed abominations. Therefore I took them away as I thought good. The suggestion then is that Sodom was too wealthy, too luxurious, and did not assist the poor and needy, the latter phrase being very similar to the accusation in Wisdom. She also committed abominations by worshipping other gods. The comparison made by Ezekiel of the fate of two cities can only belong to his own comparatively recent times. What happened to Tarshish or Gades would make such a comparison logical, but if it's referred to some very ancient city, it would have been an anachronism. The wealth of Sodom is extolled by Josephus at this time, he says. When the Assyrians had dominion over Asia, the people of Sodom were in a flourishing condition, both as to riches and the numbers of the youth. Of what time is he speaking? Of the period before the region in question was destroyed, which Genesis would have us believe date to the age of Abram, when the very name of Assyria was scarcely known. We find many events of contemporaneous Bible history which it were inconvenient to tabulate in their rightful setting, are pigeonholed in the Pentateuch. It would have not suited the scheme of the Bible chronology to have told the story of Sodom in its true synchronization. So, like Exodus, it is wedged between two totally different subjects in Genesis. Yet, it was the abbreviated account of the 13 Years' War as conducted by the Assyrians and their allies. It was then, and only then, that Assyria launched out to obtain dominion over our British lands. Let us examine the Genesis account a little more closely than is usually accorded to it. It seems that Amraphel, king of Shinar, Assyria, Arioch, king of Elessar, Assar, the name given to Odin's followers, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Persia, and Tidal, king of nations, probably Scythians and the sons of Gog-Magog, invaded the domains of Bera, king of Sodom, and 4 other kings. The Sodomites fought a battle in the Vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea, were defeated, and as a result served Chedorlaomer, paid tribute, and in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the allies returned and smote the Rephaim giants in Ashtaroth, Karnaim, Ashdod or Pelusium, the Zuzims and Ham. Elsewhere, Zanzumim, the Emims in Shaveh Kiritaim, the Horites in Mount Seir, to the plain of Paran. They turned and marched to Kadesh, when once again out came the king of Sodom and his same allies, and also again they fought a battle in the same Vale of Siddim and were defeated. Several references in this report suggest an alien origin. There are errors such as Zuzim for Zuzazumim, and a looseness, for it's difficult to believe that after 13 years with the same kings or leaders on either side, they took part in 2 battles fought on the same exact field. The Vale of Siddim, where these battles were said to have been fought, is described as the Salt Sea, presumably near the ocean, and that it was full of slime pits. Slime is an old word signifying bitumen or tar, and Josephus called this site Lake Asphaltitis, formerly the Vale of Siddim, says that the country of Sodom bordered on it, and that, owing to the impiety of its inhabitants, it was burnt by lightning. He explains further that this bitumen or pitch was used partly for caulking ships' hulls and partly for medicinal purposes, as it is to this day. The origin of this asphalt lake, which in the time of the Maccabees had shrunk to little more than a pond or mere, was that some part of the celestial body struck the earth in this particular locality and left behind the lake of pitch as a souvenir. It is no very unusual occurrence with certain so-called earthquakes, although the earthquake is a result of the impact, and as a rule such lakes dry up soon on the surface but can also penetrate deep into the earth and form oil deposits. If Josephus' description of the locality be correct, which we have no reason to doubt, it takes us back to the environs of Bristol. The site is alleged of the original Sodom or Gades or Tarshish. About 12 miles east of that city is Sodbury area, and about the same from Bath to the south, where are the small towns of Old Sodbury, Chipping Sodbury and Little Sodbury, in proximity to the Bristol coalfield. The origin of the name is lost, but is significant. In the vicinity of the Old Sodbury, on the edge of a plateau with a steep descent towards Bath, placed on the main road between Bristol and Malmesbury, stands the ancient little town of Sherston. Previously mentioned, its original Saxon name was Scorstown. I may recall otherwise Scottstown, but how came the Scots to found a town in these parts? George Syncellus, 10th century AD monk, in his chronicles says that the Scythians overran Bashan and that their camp was called Scythopolis, namely city of the Scyths or Scots. Syncellus can only be referred to the account of the Book of Judith, when Sennacherib Nebuchadnezzar sent his general Holofernes and a great army to the west, who pitched his camp at Scythopolis, allowing for the difference in composition between the didactic and elementary book of Genesis, there is little doubt that it was the same war and the same event as regards the invasion in the 14th year. Genesis, indeed, after relating the story of this battle, offers a fantastic anticlimax. According to the victors, having looted the captured cities of Sodom, retired, taking Lot as a prisoner, whereupon Abram, immediately armed his servants, numbering 318, attacked the victorious and huge Assyrian army, routed it, and pursued the enemy to Hobah, near Damascus. Here they slew Chedorlaomer, rescued Lot and his goods, and after his return, the king of Sodom, who was previously, according to the account, slain by the Assyrians at Sidith, met Abram in the vale of Shaveh, after he had disposed of all the enemy kings and their armies. Josephus attempts to make the story more palatable by saying that Abram, with his followers and his neighbours, pursued the Assyrians, found them carousing and intoxicated, destroyed most of them, and the next day continued to pursuit to Heboah. It is absurd as the Genesis legend, but both have a certain family resemblance to the account Herodotus relates, already given, when the Pharaoh similarly collected a number of untrained domestics in warfare, opposed Sennacherib's army at Pelusium, and annihilated it. The most likely interpretation that can be offered is that at this time of panic, when the Assyrians before Jerusalem were destroyed by the blast and the earthquakes with other terrifying phenomena were shattered the earth seemingly, and humanity, the survivors, were hastily retreating eastwards to return to their own countries, and were followed up by some hastily gathered levies who assaulted them. More important is another, albeit confusing, story in Genesis. It describes how the king of Sodom, after the overthrow of the... Here's some images. Prehistoric magic. This looks like Zoetic. Was it Zoroaster? Zoetic? That religion, the Syrian religion. We've got a massive stone relief in the museum here of similar images. Plate, sacred cheese showing fluorescent symbols of fire weapons. So these are meant to be some kind of fire weapons. Rod. The cherubim, or acolytes, depicted as animals or winged semi-human beings with bird heads to indicate speed, are shown manipulating the sacred trees, which are represented as expelling the destructive power. And there's Edinburgh Castle, seen from Princes Street Gardens. If any of you guys watch my videos, this is where I'm from, Edinburgh. I've got some footage of Edinburgh Castle. Assyrians, hence after the catastrophe, met Abram at the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's dale. Present at this meeting was Melchizedek, king of Salem, who brought forth bread and wine, and he was a priest of the Most High God. This king blessed Abram, and he gave him tithes of all, who was his monarch, thus extolled. The name Melchizedek, analysed, appears to consist of the word melk, or milk, king, and Hizadek, whose name was variously given as Izadek or Hezedeki, and several others. This Hezedek, king of Salem, was king of Jerusalem, whose name was derived from Aeru or Huro, holy, and Salem. We may conclude, therefore, that the king was Hezekiah, who met certain persons in the king's vale after the great catastrophe. Josephus used a notable phrase regarding him. He says he was, without dispute, the righteous king. The word righteous points to a remarkable phase of Hezekiah's character and reputation, and throws a flood of light upon the past. Whether he offered tithes to anyone on this occasion must remain an enigma. Sorry, God's sake. What did happen shortly after the Great Catastrophe is likely to have been confused and uncertain. The person described in Genesis as Abram may have been the Sethos mentioned by Herodotus, the son and successor of Amenophis, called Sethosis, Ramses. Manetho, however, indicated that Amenophis himself returned to defeat the invaders after 13 years and drove them to Syria. After this 13 years, Amenophis returned to Ethiopia with a great army, as did his son Ramses with another army also, and both of them joined battle with the shepherds and the polluted people and beat them and slew a great many of them and pursued them to the bounds of Syria. Cheremon, another Egyptian historian cited by Josephus, says that Amenophis left his wife and child behind him when he fled into Ethiopia, who were hidden in certain caverns, and that when his son, called Mesen, reached man's estate, he pursued the Jews to Syria, about 200,000 men, and received his father out of Ethiopia. It sounds very apocryphal, since the youth could have scarcely reached man's estate in those 13 years. It is more probable that Amenophis had been confused with the king of Ethiopia, for Sesotorsus called himself, or was called, the Ethiopian king as well as the Egyptian, and that an Ethiopian army, perhaps with the son of Amenophis, came in pursuit with the fleeing Assyrians. Ethiopia, as we know, was Cush, and we learnt that the Cushites were marching against Sennacherib. So Rabshakeh returned after threatening Hezekiah before the walls of Jerusalem, and found the king of Assyria warring against Libnah, for he had heard that he was departed from Lachish. And when heard say of Tirhakah, king of Cush, behold, he is to come to fight against thee, he sent messengers again unto Hezekiah. Rabshakeh was evidently hoping that Hezekiah might surrender at the last hour before he knew of this move. These varied reports agree in the main particulars. There was this 13 years war, the same war as is told by mythological of the giants against the gods, when the giants Gog and Magog were thrown under stones and rocks by the intervention of the gods Hercules and Melkarth, to whom were attributed such acts. Whatever name the invaders were known under collectively, they were directed by Sennacherib as king, but politically and even militarily by Rabshakeh, which is comprehensible when we regard the career of that extraordinary firebrand. As to the statement attributed to Manetho that Amenophis in person played a leading part in the expulsion of the Assyrians and followed them to the frontiers of Syria, it would destroy the evidence produced to indicate that he was Sesotris and was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, which agrees even with the Bible chronology, as also that he had previously indulged in wars of conquest against many of those who in turn devastated his country. According to Exodus, he was drowned while pursuing the fleeing Hebrews, a claim which fits in with the traditions that Osiris was buried in Memphis and that the body of Set, the debris and the detritus washed down to the sea, found its outlet by the titanic branch of the Nile, which, as was said earlier, may be applied to the big river estuary of the Parrett in Somerset, and which flows into the sea near Taunton or Tantown. On the other hand, we find Diodorus speaking of the Pharaoh who became Osiris, saying that he was marching with his army into Ethiopia when the flood occurred, and Manetho saying that Amenophis led his army into Ethiopia after he had found himself faced with the vast army of the Assyrians. Finally, there is a legend for what is worth of the Spanish gypsies, that the Pharaoh of the same catastrophe, together with his army, was driven into a hole in a mountain and destroyed. The truth is that the end of the Pharaoh of the Exodus remained unknown, and tradition relied on hearsay. That his young son survived and helped to take part in the drive of the frightened forces from overseas who lost their morale amid the awful scenes of destruction which came from above is quite likely. He became the Ramses of the 20th century, the 20th dynasty, and was later seemingly elevated to the position of Horus in the reconstruction of the underworld cult. In a sense, this revolves itself into an academic problem. It is only of importance in regard to the main question, which is to place before the reader as nearly as possible a correct synchronization of events in the memorable age we are examining, one which bore the enormous repercussions through the succeeding ages, and which took place in a setting not in the Near East, but in Britain. There is one further aspect of this involved period that requires some additional consideration, and that is the position of Joshua, Moses' general. Although Joshua is introduced early in the period of the Exodus, and although we are told the Hebrews, because of their grumblings and disobedience, were not to be led back to the land of Canaan, Joshua was very soon leading a trained army to those parts, fighting a series of battles and leading trained soldiers. They were newcomers in the country, who spoke with awe of the giants they had seen as they spied out the land, and the great cities fenced up to the heaven. People whose tongue they understood not, for, as Mr. E. Jessel remarks, Hebrew was not the language of Moses' followers. Who then were these newcomers, who knew little of the inhabitants whose cities and lands they conquered, finding little opposition to their arms in spite of brave isolated defences? Were they the Saxon invaders, who at some point unspecified but very clearly date entered Britain from the direction of Belgium and moved westwards until they held Wessex? Those newcomers who resettled the lands of the Egyptians and, as was seen in the telltale evidence of the division of the land, removed the further landmarks and laid out their fields on a totally different system from that of the Celtic peoples? The biblical account of the fall of Jericho is an outstanding example of the trained forces he led, for here stood another great walled city, situated in a plain with a barren plateau between it and Scythopolis. The walls collapsed when the Levites blew their trumpets, we are told, 7 priests who blew with 7 trumpets of ram's horns, who compassed the city 7 days, preceded by armed men with the arcs accompanying them, and on the 7th day, after marching round the city 7 times, the walls fell down flat. Can anyone except he be of blind faith believe that fairy tale? The truth is that Joshua possessed firearms, no other than the rods of the Assyrians, and that is how he was able to defeat and overthrow the brave defenders in their isolated cities and towns. He almost said to his followers at Shechem, when he finally conquered the land and explained how they had achieved victory, I sent the hornet before you, which drave them out before you, even the 2 kings of the Amorites, but not with thy sword or with thy bow. The term hornets is used more than once, as I will send hornets before thee, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite from before thee. Or again, moreover, the Lord thy God will send the hornet among them until they are left and hiding themselves from thee, be destroyed. In wisdom, wasps is employed as a synonym for the same purpose. It is difficult to estimate what these were that enabled Joshua to march through nations. We have the allusion to the ram's horns, which weapons blew down the walls of Jericho. Hornets, which went before, were assured the missiles used for the rods or horns. Horns of iron, be it understood. We read of horns of iron in the book of Chronicles to push the Assyrians. There is the very plain reference to Zechariah, son of Berechiah, during the captivity in Babylon. Some angel showed him 4 horns, and when Zechariah asked what they were, he was told, These are the horns which have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. These euphemisms explain themselves and throw a clear light upon the true reason why and how Joshua attained his easy victories. The account of Joshua's defeat of Adon-Izadek, king of Jerusalem, is open to considerable doubt, although the mere mention of that city implies the far later period of Joshua's activities, since the Israelites only went there in David's reign. According to the book of Joshua, after he had captured Ai, otherwise Aijalon, and the city of Gibeon had capitulated, Adonizadek introduced the kings of Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon to reunite him with the attack of Gibeon, for its desertion to their cause. A battle is described near Gibeon, where the 5 kings were defeated with great slaughter and fled to a cave at Makkedah, from whence they were brought out and hanged upon trees. You must doubt the truth of that claim that the king of Jerusalem was fighting in the neighbourhood of Gibeon in the west, or that he was hanged on a tree. His name is precisely the name of Melchizedek, except that the prefix Adon signifies Lord, used in the place of Meli, king. In short, the king so mentioned answers in name to Hezekiah. So what page is this? 213. How many have we got left? 273. So 60 pages left, guys. I think I might leave it there today and finish it in one more session. Let's see. Where was I? Anyway, guys, I'll find my place when I come back. I think I'll leave it there today. That's two sessions. Right, guys. I'll have a quick look at chat before I go, because I've got visitors coming up right now. Right, who's here? That's Ali B. Haunted house. He is doing an impression of a ball earth arsehole at the moment. Leave him alone. Dan W. Jed and Arwen live at the same time. Live at the same time. I'm torn. It's pronounced Sennacherib, not Sennacherib. Sennacherib. Thanks. I'll remember that, Timaeus. Sennacherib. Cool. Stop stuttering. Right, anyway. I might be back again today to finish this. I don't know. Anyway, hope you have a great day, guys. Take it easy. See you next time.